All right, so this is my brief little overview on my final project titled Deterrence in the KC-135. You're going to have to forgive me a little bit in part of some of the bias that's kind of in this. I have to say, after being a structures mechanic working on these things for nearly 8 years now, I've developed a slight love affair for the aircraft, so there is that. However, the information that is contained within is accurate, so just bear with me in that point. So let's get started here. I first started off with the history of aerial refueling in and of itself. The KC-135 is the U.S. Air Force's main aerial refueler that it uses. And its use in the Air Force is quite important. That's why I chose to do my project on it. So starting off here, the first actual true aerial refueling was undertaken by three gentlemen who were known as local barnstormers, where they did all of the wing walking stunts and whatnot. And in 1921, these three men, known as Wesley or Wes May, Frank Hawks, and Earl Dougherty, got together and decided they wanted to get some gas from one airplane to another. And their big plan was to have one of the guys fly up with a 5-gallon jerry can filled with aviation fuel, and another take off behind them. And they would fly close enough to each other where the one with the jerry can would wing walk over to the next aircraft, climb aboard, walk carefully over to the cockpit, climb in, open up the gas can, open up the fuel tank, and pour it in. And that was their big plan. So needless to say, it was quite dangerous and not very conventional or practical by any means. But they ended up carrying out this stunt without a hitch. The only problem they really encountered was it took a super long time for the jerry can to empty due to the all the wind and vibrations that they normally experience in flight in an open cockpit. But it was pretty cool. They had a chase plane that captured everything, so that's what that photo is at the bottom left. These are the two aircraft that they used. It was a Lincoln Standard biplane and a Curtiss Jenny. The Jenny is at the bottom right. The Lincoln Standard is at the top right. The Jenny is actually known as one of the worst aircraft ever developed by the United States, but that's a different story, I guess. Later on, the more famous act was done by the U.S. Army Air Service in 1923. Theirs was a little more conventional in that they used a flexible hose that was let out by a lead aircraft and caught by a trailing aircraft, and that hose was attached from the an auxiliary fuel tank in the lead, and attached to the main fuel tank in the trail aircraft. And then fuel is transferred between the two. And they were able to do this in August using three of these DH-4B biplanes. That's what these are. That's what you can see here in the photographs. These are de Havillands. And they were able to successfully transfer over 37 hours 687 gallons of fuel and 38 gallons of oil, because at that time the engines ran through a lot of oil based on the technology that they had at that time. But the more real conventional stuff was developed after World War II. Once World War II erupted, a lot of that was put on hold. And so this, as you can see here, is a retrofitted B-29. This is one of the first real attempts that the military made toward making something that could really work. The B-29 was able to use not only a flexible hose, but they had also developed a flying boom. That was a rigid tube that could be extended from the rear of the aircraft and plugged in, for lack of a better term, to the aircraft that needed to be refueled. And the flying boom ended up being one of the better ways of refueling because the flexible hose had a limited amount that could be transferred through the hose at one time, whereas the rigid boom could transfer a much higher volume at once. And so that was what the KC-135 ended up with. Although the boom can be retrofitted to accept a flexible hose and cage, that sort of trails along as the 135 cruises along, but mainly everything now runs off of that flyable boom. It was first introduced in 1957 to the military, developed and started production in 1955. It was modeled after the Boeing 707 airliner that Boeing had at the time. Here in this photograph you can see the 135 has the old TF-33 engines on it. They were the same engines that were used on the B-52 bombers. As you can see here, they only had 4 on this aircraft, despite the extremely heavy fuel loads that these aircraft had. That's what they used. That's really all they had at the time. But the 135 saw its first real missions during the Vietnam War. And it was first really intended to be more of like a force extender, which is really a fancy way of saying they wanted their bombers to have longer range. But as the war progressed, it became increasingly apparent that the 135's ability as a force multiplier was really unprecedented. And what that means is they started using the 135 to refuel fighters as well as bombers. At the time, they had the F-4 and the F-105 fighters, and it enabled not only the bombers to reach deeper into North Vietnam, but the fighters to spend longer hours at the front rather than spending mere minutes. And this use of the 135 completely changed the Air Force's view and strategy towards aerial support. Also at this time, deterrence was beginning to be a main military strategy for the United States. Deterrence is really progressing your military strength to the point where your adversaries are too afraid of initiating any sort of attack for fear of being completely and totally annihilated in the retaliation. However, the use of aerial refueling being a main aspect of U.S. deterrence strategy wasn't really implemented until about 1959. And that was after the Strategic Air Command really truly grasped the awesome capabilities of the 135. This was because at the time the ICBM, or Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, hadn't yet been developed. And so bombers such as the B-52 and the B-47 were really the only means of delivering any sort of nuclear payload to the enemy. And keeping those bombers aloft for longer than it was intended was a huge benefit For instance, in 1960, Operation Chrome Dome was put into full force. On the right, you can see one of the routes that was flown. And this is, of course, marked November through December of 1964. You can see on the left there all the fleets of B-52s there that were used. But then, of course, once the ICBM was fully developed and in use, these operations sort of fell away, and the more modern use of aerial refueling and the role that it plays in deterrence sort of shifted into what it is. And that is mainly being used as a force multiplier. So later, after the Vietnam War, the next really critical phase in aerial refueling and its demonstration was during Operation Desert Storm. And the modern strategies for the 135 were really refined at that time when they were deployed to forward air bases in England, Saudi Arabia, and Diego Garcia. This was along with other flight platforms like the KC-10 and the KC-130. But really, the 135 was the king of all of them. Over on the top right is the KC-10, and underneath there is the KC-30. KC-130, I'm sorry. So really, the aircraft station in Saudi Arabia flew a constant path in a neutral zone known as the Frisbee, in which coalition aircraft could fly to and be refueled whenever necessary and provide constant air support to the ground troops below. The role in the 135 and keeping those aircraft aloft was truly key and critical to the success of all the missions that were undertaken in Operation Desert Storm. And so, currently, today, the 135 is actually still in use, despite its age. Hence my having been involved in their maintenance. The cost of the maintenance of the 135, though, has been increasing exponentially as the years have been going by, and that's why a new aerial refueler, the KC-46, as you see in the bottom left there in that image, is what is scheduled to replace the 135. That being said, the 135 is expected to fly at least until 2050 and provide aerial refueling missions up until that point. The fleet is still very large, having over 800 aircraft still in service, with very few of the original ones ever being taken out of service due to accidents or age. And the airframe has definitely seen numerous improvements as the years have gone by, enabling it to continue its great service today. So really, I have to say, despite its very plain and under-impressive looks, especially when compared to something like an SR-71 Blackbird or the F-35 Lightning, the role the 135 plays is undeniably critical in today's United States Air Force military strategy, especially when it comes to deterrence. All of our weapon systems that we use all depend upon the 135 and its ability to refuel its aircraft. And so it continues to fly today as really an unsung hero. And because you don't really hear about it much at all, especially because of the way it looks. It's quite plain. But without it, much of what was accomplished in the past would not have been possible to nearly the same degree as it was. And it will continue to be that way as we roll on to the future. Even as the 135 is replaced by the KC-46, aerial refueling as being a main component and deterrent strategy will always